I gave Qui-Gon my word. I will train Anakin. Without the approval of the Council, if I must.
Qui-Gon's defiance I sense in you. Need that you do not.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be part 1 of the complete life of Obi-Wan Kenobi in canon, putting every comic, novel, show, movie, and more all into chronological order, taking us from his homeworld, earliest memories of the Jedi Temple, apprenticeship under Qui-Gon, and his rise to become the greatest threat to the dark side in the history of the galaxy. Defeating Maul, training the Chosen One and his son, and develop a mastery for knowing when to attack and when to sacrifice.
And then the whole Chosen One nonsense? Your doubts are understandable, my padawan, Qui-Gon said. His tone became dry as he continued. Certainly they are shared by most Jedi today, including the Council.
That clip comes from the audiobook version of Master and Apprentice, a canon novel that gets into the most difficult time in Kenobi's apprenticeship to Qui-Gon. The issues with prophecy, Dooku leaving the Order, and really shows how Kenobi was starting to grow into the man we see in The Phantom Menace and beyond. And you can get it free thanks to our sponsor Audible. Sign up today to receive 1 month free, giving you access to their entire Plus catalog, containing everything from podcasts, fitness, meditation, and sleep aids, on top of their library of thousands of audiobooks. I think these audiobook versions are the best versions of these stories, as the sound effects, subtle music, and outstanding narration really put you in a galaxy far, far away. If you love it as much as I do and stay on after your free trial, you will get 1 credit every month to apply to any audiobook you want, and those credits roll over each month so you never lose them. If you cancel, you still keep all of your credits and can still spend them whenever you wish, as well as having access to all the audiobooks in your library forever. Some of the highest rated Star Wars content is waiting for you down in the link below. Visit audible.com/metanerds or text metanerds to 500-500 for 1 free audiobook and a 30-day free trial. Our story begins 57 years before the Battle of Yavin. Obi-Wan Kenobi was born on the planet Stujon, a world that was essentially unheard of by everyone else in the galaxy, located at grid coordinates M13, right next to Hosnian Prime and Quarzite. While most younglings were detected by 6 months of age, this boy would not be contacted by the Jedi Order until the age of 3. All people born in the Republic would be subject to a blood test, and entered into some sort of centralized system, which the Order used to detect higher levels of midichlorians. And this list was stored on at least 1 important holocron, with an individual designated as the keeper of the Kyber memory crystal safeguarding this list. We can only speculate how it is that Kenobi was almost overlooked by the Order. Perhaps this was a subtle manipulation by the Force itself, either trying to keep him out, or being a part of a precedent that would prove useful a generation later, as he would be connected to one of the most controversial children ever admitted to the Order. But after representatives met with his parents, explained his strange abilities and the future that was ahead of this boy, Obi-Wan would spend every day of his life from then on out consumed with the Jedi traditions. Group meditations with various masters and children of all species, and specifically he would closely train in lightsaber combat with Sin Dralig, the man with the title of Battle Master and Chief of Security of the Jedi Temple. A decade would pass from a rival on Coruscant to a proud and powerful Padawan, and at 13, Yoda and the High Council would agree to assign Padawan Kenobi to Master Qui-Gon Jinn, a man that was always at odds with the Council and their narrow understanding of the Force that strayed from the more mystical roots. Dooku had raised Qui-Gon to appreciate the history of the Order, their lost prophecies, the mad mystic Jedi who had powers that would be now seen as sacrilegious, too irrational and close to the dark side. Yet their method did seem to bring them closer to the will of the Force itself. As Qui-Gon felt this, it helped him and Dooku to grow closer, with similar temperaments and interests. But this Kenobi kid was a stickler for protocol, too uptight and eager to obey, trying to mimic the current High Council, and not interested in these mystical traditions. This designation seemed odd to Qui-Gon, until he realized that they may have done this on purpose, to rein himself in, and help to make this promising and powerful Kenobi more open-minded and confident in his own abilities. But over the years, Qui-Gon felt guilty at times that he was holding the Padawan back, being placed under a semi-self-imposed outcast master.
Qui-Gon felt a pang of guilt. Obi-Wan had such potential, such promise. He deserved a master who could bring it out in him. They'd been an uneasy match from the start, with misunderstandings and emotional swings.
Even later, when he would become Skywalker's master, Kenobi would think back to this time with Qui-Gon and understood that their styles were very different. His earliest missions would take him to everything from simple fortresses to Queen's complexes on Alderaan, and even a lengthy stay on Mandalore when he was around 15 to 17 years old. This world that spawned countless Jedi killers, the most ferocious warriors in the galaxy, would also introduce him to the love of his life. The new Mandalorian political party was trying to dramatically shift their culture away from war, to be more of a pacifist and open civilization. Death Watch would hope to retain the Mandalorian warrior values, and from the mid-40s BBY on, they would launch terrorist-style attacks across Mandalore and its colonies, and became a major military power. The Council would send Qui-Gon and his padawan to help keep the peace, being a mediator for both sides, and never forget to actively act as spies for the Order, and by extension for the Republic, as Mandalore was not a Republic world, and one of their longest enemies. You can see how reasonable it was for natives to feel like the new Mandalorian party was selling out to galactivists, working with their hated enemy, one that was filled with corruption, and managed to get themselves involved in more wars throughout the galaxy than even the Mandalorians. This sentiment must have been felt by many of them, because the wars here turned Mandalore into a wasteland. Duchess Satine was born in the colony world Kelvala, into the noble family with her father Duke Adonia Kryze. They had moved to Mandalore with hopes of rising to become rulers. Satine was an infant at this time and would speak her first words on Mandalore, and was the last generation to touch the wild grasses of the fields. As in the coming decades, nuclear weapons would destroy much of the natural world, forcing them to rebuild into these domed and cubed cities, acting like self-sufficient islands in this lifeless world. By the time Qui-Gon was sent here, it was clear that the Kryze family would rule this new Mandalorian order, and bounty hunters were swarming all members of the family. Qui-Gon and Kenobi would take charge of Duchess Satine's security, fleeing into the not-yet-nuked wilderness, hiding out for a full year in this intensely emotional setting. The two teenagers started to fall madly in love for each other, and while many details of this year of his life are still sparse, it would stick with him forever, being the greatest test of his commitment to the Jedi path. When the call came from the High Council to leave Mandalore, the galaxy was lucky that this young man in love had a personality that tended towards service and discipline, as he would obey his master and the council above them, returning to Coruscant with a racing heart and troubled mind. But their next mission would provide plenty of distraction, as the Hutt-controlled world of Teth was getting a bit too flagrant with their corruption, threatening neighboring worlds and too involved in Republic politics. As they snuck into the palace, they were spotted and had to flee blaster fire, and Qui-Gon noted his padawan was still too uncomfortable and shaken in combat.
Is he winded already? Obi-Wan hasn't perfected meditation and combat. Qui-Gon reminded himself as his padawan's steps echoed behind his on the long staircase. By his age, I was able to... Qui-Gon stopped himself. Comparisons between his training and Obi-Wan's weren't constructive.
Once they made it into Wanbo the Hutt's throne room / nightclub, Jin did compliment his padawan's instincts. Whatever nervousness was in Kenobi's mind, something took over him which allowed him to dodge the bolts and odd weaponry from Gamorrean guards to acid-spitting spice heads. Though there was still miscommunication even after 4 years of apprenticeship.
Blast it! Qui-Gon thought. I meant take care of the guards at the door! You could have said so! Obi-Wan shouted. Which was true. Always with the specific instructions. Must he be so literal?
Destroying the wall panel also controlled the hovering pleasure platforms, that now were crashing into everything in the room. More chaos that made Kenobi seem even more frantic in combat, if still effective. But Qui-Gon made it behind Wambo and put his saber just centimeters from his thick Hutt neck. The Lord was feebly flailing, and spice heads were still staring at the ceiling in detached bliss, while guards finally lowered their weapons. Obi-Wan was running to get them a ship, and the Master thought to himself that the Council would not be happy to hear that he resorted to taking a hostage, but that was what the situation called for. When he lowered the platform into the hangar, he saw Kenobi had been captured by 5 guards in the Hutt's major domo. An hour would pass with threats of mutual destruction before cooler heads prevailed and Qui-Gon was in the major domo's office sipping tea and discussing terms. Even the Hutts would not openly kill Jedi. And as he made sure to make the Hutt's puppet master aware that the Republic knew of the missing food shipments to the Outer Rim, without directly blaming the major domo, he knew this would force them to cool off the piracy for a while, before this whole exercise had to be repeated, with a different Jedi and a new Hutt rival taking over, and Qui-Gon felt that the old Jedi mystic's hopes for a complete and radical enlightenment of sentient species was naive. And on the flight home, we see how a teenage Kenobi was seen by his elders, as the boy was eager to be a competent knight, so talented, yet still confused and stressed by his failures.
In many ways, Obi-Wan was so mature for his age, so steady, that Qui-Gon sometimes forgot he was just 17 years old. Only in moments like this did Qui-Gon realize how gawky his padawan still was, how both the past child and the future man could be glimpsed in his face.
And Qui-Gon thought how there were plenty of orthodox-loving, literal-interpreting Jedi Masters out there. Why did he have to be so at odds with his style? Kenobi worked up an apology, and when he said he could do better, Jin assured him that they both could, and just to focus on the next mission. The Padawan took control of the Rainhawk, as he did always like the calm predictability of flying. And while his master meditated, Kenobi was ranting in his head about how useless the archaic mystical traditions were. Jin's love for them led to their incongruence. That rules were rules for a reason. Literal was effective and reliable. This woo-woo stuff was silly and hard for others to grasp, yet he did acknowledge that this flow style did seem to work for his master. When he got back to the temple, 17-year-old Kenobi was tasked with scanning through the temple archives, lamenting how his classmates are off with masters that specialized in exotic animal studies, making force bonds in the mind of odd beasts and discovering new civilizations, or buddies like Jape, whose master headed the Grand Orbital Observatory on Coruscant, always on some new mission to capture astronomical phenomena, pushing the edge of understanding the natural world. While he was bored to death, translating dead languages for his master's shunned hobby.
But what really irritated Obi-Wan was the reason for this fascination. Nobody puts much stock in the old prophecies any longer. Obi-Wan thought sullenly as he looked over yet more old Alderaan in.
And he couldn't square this with his master's realistic and straightforward demeanor in all other aspects of his life. This mystical side had practical ramifications like dangerous play with morality, stealing a ship, or selling off your Padawan's favorite cloak for chips to gamble with, which was all okay. You could even use the Force to cheat in that game, if it won some tribe their freedom from a tyrant. Later that night, he had translated some more prophecies, only to feel like it was all a waste of time, containing vague phrases like, "She who will be born to darkness will give birth to darkness," or "When the Kyber that is not Kyber shines forth, the time of prophecy will be at hand."
When the righteous lose the light, evil once dead shall return. That's so vague it could refer to anything or anyone. And then the whole chosen one nonsense? Your doubts are understandable, my Padawan.
On that remark, Qui-Gon warned him not to consider it all nonsense, despite Yoda's warning against trying to understand the future. And after taking some time to word it correctly, he told Kenobi that he no longer thought of the prophecies as literal, but they predicted constants across all time, how large groups of people inevitably behaved, and taught us about the prophecy makers at the very least. Qui-Gon admitted his belief in prophecies being literally true, like most of his optimism about a great heroic destruction of evil, had slowly died down over the years. Obi-Wan is concerned about Yoda's warning that peering into the future could lead to the dark side, but his master dismisses this as being no different than wielding a lightsaber or getting involved in politics. Yoda's line of reasoning would have the Jedi being impotent and isolated monks, hiding away in some far-off cave. Better to shine light on everything, including these prophecies. When Obi-Wan pressed further, to assert that it was a kind of arrogance to try and predict the future, to not just trust the will of the Force, his master's answer was short and ended the debate.
I don't set myself up as judge of the ancient mystics, and neither should you.
The Padawan pushed further to ask how long these studies would continue, being 2 years at this point, and his master's face grew odd and a bit grim, saying not to worry about it, that they would talk more later, to go have some time off and go play with his friends. Kenobi rushed down to the lower levels of the temple, hoping to get a game of Dejarik in, but those comments haunted him. And though Qui-Gon hoped the boy would have a nice break, the next day they were summoned by Depa Billaba to a secret meeting with Chancellor Karame's Kaj. The Togruta female greeted the master and apprentice, knowing Kenobi's name before introduction, and she promptly displayed a holo of the Birna Mall of the Inner Rim, showing Zerka Corporation hyperspace routes. Qui-Gon instantly understood the importance. That this company had solved a centuries-long problem of charting this region and establishing a reliable, if still tricky, hyperspace route. The Chancellor showed that this whole system relied on the planet Pajal and its moon for housing the powerful hyper-anchors that stabilized the main lane. But this moon was proving a harsh mistress, as insurgents had been sabotaging efforts to connect this long-isolated region to the galaxy at large. Kenobi and even his hard-to-shake master were in humorous disbelief when she explained that these terrorists started as a theater group, moving into political material and then finally explosives. Pijal was ruled by a monarch, a crowned princess of just 14, who was set to change the rule from absolute to constitutional and open up galactic trade. Years earlier, infighting from the nobles prompted a request to the Jedi for a mediator, and this came in the form of Rael Averross, friend of Qui-Gon and Dooku's padawan before him. The Chancellor says he asked for Qui-Gon's help personally, and casually remarks that she knows this is bad timing, with Jyn having just been asked to join the High Council. At that, Kenobi's shock was so strong, Qui-Gon felt it in the Force. He had not told his padawan about the offer yet.
Obi-Wan felt as though he couldn't speak, couldn't hear. He was aware of nothing but his own breath and pulse. The shock he felt numbed him to anything else except a sense of shame.
He would call on all his strength to fight back the feeling of being an outcast, a failure that couldn't get along with his own master. He wondered if everyone else already knew that he was about to be dumped onto another master, so abruptly and without care for him, after 4 years of apprenticeship. He was also filled with flashes of a simple and pure rage, telling himself that anger sometimes refused to leave the soul except through the body. So he spent hours stomping through the temple, through every level of the complex until it was late into the night, disregarding the protocols and rules about a Padawan's curfew. Feeling like an absolute failure, the one thought that kept bubbling up was,
or would he have to explain to everyone why he was a 17-year-old Padawan in search of a new master? He'd never even heard of that before. Was he the first disposable Padawan in the 10,000-year history of the Jedi?
He went lower and lower through the levels until he came to the Padawan's dojo, and after a long time pacing and futilely trying to calm his mind, he turned to his blade and worked through the basic forms with perfection and increasing speed and intensity. No master could deny his ability with the saber. Even if his mystic master tried to blame him for misunderstanding orders, he knew he was a great warrior. But again, why did he know Old Alderaanian, but still wasn't taught the more advanced saber forms? Fine, he would prove to any masters checking the holocams or walking by that he had perfected the basic offense and defensive moves. Someone else would see this better than Jyn did, and when his master's voice boomed out into the room, trying to offer a compliment, Kenobi hid his surprise and delivered a cold and even response.
Its blue light casting everything beyond it, including Qui-Gon in black and white. This is the Padawan's dojo, Obi-Wan said.
Qui-Gon tried to explain why he hadn't told him about the offer, that he was still considering it, and Kenobi burst into laughter as he couldn't believe anyone would have to think twice about getting the most prestigious position in the entire galaxy. Jyn kept trying to find a new way to explain, to get past his Padawan's anger, but when it seemed hopeless, the master turned away and said they both needed time to calm down and focus their thoughts. But watching his master literally walk out on him after this figurative abandonment was too much, and he yells at Jyn that he finally figured out why he never trained him further into the advanced saber forms.
Because you decided a long time ago that you'd get rid of me one way or another. That we wouldn't work as master and Padawan, so why bother planning ahead? Why even try?
And ended his rant with a twisting of the knife at his master's useless obsession.
You knew it would be up to someone else to finish my training. Obi-Wan flicked his lightsaber off. You turned out to be a prophet after all, Master.
Qui-Gon was quiet for a long time after, finally and calmly responding by saying that if Kenobi could understand why, he could have understood his master better, and they would have excelled. When he did leave, his master would sit up late that night reviewing the old holo recordings from the file on Rael Averross, in his last mission with his Padawan. Nanomachines hijacked the Padawan's body, but her mind was still intact, forced to watch as her master killed her. He knew this was the best choice in the battle, but the look on Nim's face when she was fatally cut through by her own master was one that had haunted him for years. Rael's unconventional fighting style was seen as a cause of her getting exposed to this combat, but the council also thought that this was due to him being introduced to the order at 5 years old. At that time, the oldest youngling they had ever taken, and he still had ties to his Ringovinda family and loved the culture. never fully fitting in with the Jedi of Coruscant. While thinking about how Kenobi's difficulties may be tied to his late introduction to the Order, he was interrupted by Yoda contacting him to ask that he use the plea from Rael to reach out to their shared master Dooku, who had recently withdrawn from the Order entirely. In this conversation, Yoda reveals that he did not think Jin was suitable for the High Council, but respected the other member's choice. When the holo ended, both Jin and Kenobi spent that night confused and frustrated by their perceived shortcomings in the eyes of their superiors. The following day they were off to Pajal, and Kenobi used his love of ships and protocol to keep him busy and away from his soon-to-be ex-master. Checking the manifest to make sure all the hyperspace corridor materials were there, monitor the various sensors, and trade stories with the pilots on this consular-class cruiser. When they did run into each other, Jin explained the details of Averross's final mission with his padawan, and what their current mission entailed, as well as touching on his very real concerns of joining the council. A conversation that helped return things to normal as they descended through the antique shielding of Pajal, the shields that were made to just block solar flares and nothing more, and Obi-Wan was shocked and a bit anxious at the idea that a planet could have no protection from bombardments or the unpredictable stray asteroid. Jin thought to himself how it was stunning to see how being raised in a temple made one think that Coruscant was the norm. Jedi had to spend years unlearning this. There were so many ways in which the Jedi were kept out of touch with reality. They also spotted a small armada of Zerka Corporation ships that were to help the government establish trade, and which had been both the lifeline and often oppressors of people on Pajal for some time. And then a strange sight of a soul ship, an ancient relic that was one of the first spacefaring vessels of these people, still maintained and used as palaces of worship like a traveling temple. But as Jin explained what it was, a blue flame exploded on the exterior. They donned spacesuits, closed in and made the leap to inspect it, only to find some other mysterious ship seemed to have helped prevent it, firing an anti-plasma torpedo, something that would put out the flame, before that mystery ship zipped off. Strange intro to this world, but once they got inside, it got even stranger as Kenobi was trying not to hurl in the zero-gravity primitive vessel. Even Jin was queasy with the blur of bodies floating by. When they landed, a rude Zerka agent at the port sorted the passengers returning from their religious ride to space back into the areas for free men or slaves. When he realized these two were Jedi, he snapped into formality and obeyed Jin's order to have everybody brought to medbay for examination, just as a way to give them a long break before being forced back to slave work, prompting Kenobi to note that the one fact that he always loved was how compassionate his master was, and he had to admit that he shouldn't be attributing malice to what could be explained by his mysteriousness. He couldn't really think Jin wanted to reject him callously. Minutes later, Rael Averross, here called the Lord Regent, met with his old friend, and Kenobi could not believe that he was meeting someone with even less concern for orthodoxy than his own master. The late middle-aged man with a graying beard and strange combo of Jedi and royal robes, while still looking disheveled, went right into old war stories with Jin, and how Dooku had fallen off the map, while Jin confesses that he wasn't ready to debate the principles of the Order.
Rael gave him a knowing look. An argument you don't want to lose, you mean? You've always been a rebel, Qui-Gon. If Dooku talked to you long enough, you'd probably walk out the door right after him.
And to defend his master, Kenobi blurts out that to the contrary, Jin was about to be a council member. Rael laughed and pleaded that they all try to call Dooku now. When Kenobi asked to go ship watching at the port, Jin and Rael relaxed and caught up on the last 8 years, eventually coming to talk of the old prophecies. Rael hinting that maybe the one that warned of a Jedi ascending to the highest position, despite the fears of those that served with him, must be about Jin sitting on the council. And when Jin said that they weren't literal, Rael laughed, saying that that's what he always had to explain to Qui-Gon all those years ago, when that naive new Padawan thought the prophecies would really play out one day. From this port, they would descend down to the planet's surface, into the palace built into the mountainside, incorporating nature into the architecture. And after a short introduction to the Crown Princess, they were off exploring the palace with Rael, and Kenobi was fascinated with the aesthetic here, the inversion of ostentation, with the tables being gilded on the underside. The chairs were plain, but with fancy cushions, so that they were concealed when used. He loved the notion of having grandeur, yet concealing it. They met all the court advisors, and Obi-Wan was keen to spot the resentment they all had for Averross. Together they watched holos that showed the growth from stunts to outright terrorist attacks, and Captain Darren, head of security, wanted them to focus on protecting the Queen long enough to make it through the treaty ceremony, and then they could investigate. And then to complicate things was the Great Hunt, a ritual that showed that the ruler could provide for her people. It could expose her to opposition terrorists, but without it, she would be considered null and void. As they discussed the royal schedule more, they finally retired to their quarters that night, and Qui-Gon cryptically told Kenobi that they would fly to the moon on an unassuming ship, but not to look for the opposition. The following day, Qui-Gon would have his Padawan pilot float in low orbit as they scanned for the signature of the mysterious craft that saved the Soul Ship earlier, picking up on a signature hidden deep in some forest region. And after some lurking through the bushes, they find a pair of beings next to a ship, working in a cave with glittering orange crystals. The man was Pax, and the female was Rahana, and he explained that they thought that these were Kyber, but with closer microscopic observation, it showed that they were Colon. Though Qui-Gon said he could detect some vibration in the Force, and when Jin explained that he knew they helped the ship the day before, Rahana explained why by showing the scar on her hand, from the long-removed Zerka Corporation slave tag, explaining that the company used a special chemical that burns the skin in a way that Bacta could never fully repair, and that she had to step in and save those innocent people on board. When Obi-Wan was able to slice the ship's computer and see a haul of stolen jewels, they agreed with the Jedi to help them search for the terrorist on the moon, using their smuggling vessel to fly under the radar. And that night, Obi-Wan finally tells his master that he can't believe they are working with them.
These people steal for a living, and we agreed to let them get away with it. And you're laughing at me. I'm laughing at moral absolutism. You just happen to be displaying it at the moment.
As Jin explained that this all started because these thieves went out of their way to save people, Kenobi wilted. As his master explained his motives further, he was baffled at how Jin had been thinking of using this mission as a way to redeem these people, to lift them out of the low rat race of chasing the next heist. Obi-Wan repeated Jin's mantra that people are more than their worst act, and that they are more than the worst thing ever done to them. When the conversation turned to Rael Averross, they stumbled over the trust between Jedi, and still raw wounds of Jin's promotion. To his own surprise, Jin was sharp in his response.
You're too dedicated to ideals rather than reality, Obi-Wan, to the point of sacrificing your principles.
Kenobi tried to say that the Jedi were meant to be the ideal, but he knew that they were always getting involved in less than moral alliances, from Hutts to politicians, and as they tried not to launch into a fight in this tiny smuggler ship, Obi-Wan turned things to the old prophecy of the Kyber that was not Kyber. Could it mean this colon crystal? That night, Jin had a nightmare-like vision of an attack on Princess Fanry. This was possible, but he also saw the red flame of a Sith, those long-extinct, ancient enemies of the Jedi. Proof that the visions were not literal. But despite being the middle of the night, he wanted to discuss this vision with Rael immediately, and walked into his room to have a long conversation about everything from Obi-Wan to Dooku, and the lost Padawan, Nim. But then a scream rang out through the palace. Rael bolted past Jin. As they both ran through the halls, he was happy to see that Obi-Wan was already ahead of them, sprinting towards the royal chamber. They burst into the space, only to find a startled princess and single attendant. Fanry explained that she saw a figure in the window, and they noticed a small dart was left on the sill. They realized this was a slicer dart, the same type that delivered nanomachines into Nim, a clear message to Rael that his new charge would meet the same torturous death. As they conducted interviews of the entire palace staff, leading into the morning hours, Minister Ornth was livid and blaming Rael, saying his pushing for a constitutional assembly to make Zerka more powerful and connect this palace to galactic trade, this was what was driving the people mad, and the princess was targeted by these terrorists when Rael should be the true target. And in the morning, the terrorists struck again. But to everyone's surprise, it was just a simple balloon that floated up from the sea, with the enormous words saying, "End tyranny, end Zerka." And back at the palace, his master left him with the princess and her advisors while he talked with Rael. The girl was eager to learn more of the lightsaber. He showed her how to open it up and how it all worked, and her eyes lit up at the sight of the crystal within.
Are all lightsaber blades blue? The Kyber crystals do determine the color of the blade, but they only take on their colors after their bond with the Jedi who've chosen them.
And he explained that while this wasn't completely understood, what was clear was that true darkness of the soul of the ancient Sith did turn their blades into a dark red. But he quickly moved the conversation to their other tools and combat styles, and she was fascinated at what saber combat would look like. A question that was so odd, Obi-Wan couldn't understand her point for a while. She wasn't asking about ceremonial displays, but actual violent combat, with saber clashing against saber. She asked how the Force would operate in something like this, but he thought that was just unfathomable, something that was lost to ancient times, just like those old prophecies. The world just wasn't like that anymore, and she half-jokingly pushed that it could happen. But Kenobi just said no. He could never imagine two Jedi's blades being used against each other. When he rejoined his master, they watched holos of various attacks over the world and moon, with the opposition pulling some stunts like messages in front of temples, or pumping a temporarily harmless chemical into the atmosphere that would make it a deep red for a couple days, and a bombing of a Zerka warehouse after hours. Obi-Wan wasn't impressed, noting that they could never be certain that an odd janitor or person returning to the warehouse could have been killed. And Jin was impressed with his Padawan speaking up to the advisors. And it was actually Kenobi who posited that it could be several different groups, with only one branch acting violently. Perhaps even the stunts were planned ahead of time. A few hours later, they were preparing for the ceremonial hunt, and he was distraught to hear that they could have no technological devices. He was so anxious and downright worried at the idea of being cut off from communications. No way to contact his master, out of the reach of the Council on Coruscant, and worse was that he would have to ride an actual beast, not a speeder. Qui-Gon assured him that while the Varactyl may look intimidating, it could actually be easier than any machine if he used their shared existence in the Force.
And then he felt it. The beast's soul, simpler and purer than that of a sentient, yet still intelligent in its way.
And later thought to himself, was it possible that riding could be more fun than flying? As Jin explained the rules, to be the first to hunt down a spider droid across the perilous terrain, they would line up, and he caught himself giving words of encouragement to his mount. With a ceremonial horn, the hunt was on, and after some time, Kenobi found himself alongside the princess and a few others that were keeping up with the prey. But just as Fanry's mount closed in, the bushes exploded with rapid blaster fire. Her mount skid and flipped over, and she took cover behind it while Obi-Wan rushed into the fray, using trees as cover and deflecting bolts back into the brush, progressing towards the target, while Rael caught up and took the defensive, right next to Fanry, whirling his blade to send back every bolt. Qui-Gon was cut off, but when he did catch up, he and his Padawan realized that it was the prey droid that was relentlessly firing on the princess. Together they were able to slice its legs and send it toppling over to an explosive end. And Jin noted that unlike in the Hutt Palace mission, his Padawan wasn't out of breath at all. In fact, he made a little quip about how exciting the coronation was. A cockiness Jin didn't exactly approve of, but he did like to see him loosening up and confident. Rael was in a rage the like of which Kenobi had never seen from a Jedi, and this rage kept him from seeing what was obvious to Qui-Gon, who pointed out that all of the hired mercenary sniper lookouts, droid sentries, and their own review of the terrain before the race, meant that the droid must have been altered at the palace. Investigating the grounds would be left to Rael, while Kenobi and Jin rejoined their thief allies and returned to the moon search. And on this trip, he inadvertently shot down an unusually sensitive Jin, who was reaching out to his Padawan to see his thoughts on the dream vision. But the 17-year-old simply said,
"Surely we have more pressing concerns, better ways of searching for an answer. Dream analysis would be guesswork at best."
And when they returned to one of the caves monitored before, it picked up a dramatic increase in protons, likely from proton torpedoes. So Qui-Gon had them set down the ship, and he and Obi made a stealthy approach through the jungle. After marking their targets, they sprung into attack, but they quickly realized that their sabers were just bouncing off, actually repulsed as they struck these black-clad terrorists. Jin noticed a faint layer of orange-reddish energy encircling the targets, and knew it was a type of personal shield projector far stronger than anything he'd ever seen before, or ever heard of. Immediately, he yelled to Obi-Wan to retreat, and called back to their smugglers for evac. But as they were surrounded, they realized that one group started firing on the other group. And when the smoke cleared, a voice called out to put down their weapons. Jin refused, but did say that they just came to investigate, not as an execution squad. The voices from the bushes took some time, but agreed to holster their weapons, and the Jedi's blades retracted, before one woman stepped forward saying that she was Halen Azuka, the leader of the opposition, and they wanted to know why they were being framed. As they walked together through the jungle, they noticed that these people very much looked like a bunch of theater kids with guns, not the trained Black Ops guys they fought earlier. She went on to explain that they assumed that those guys were Zerka Ops, but they attacked Zerka ships too, so the opposition had no clue who they fought for. As they welcomed the Jedi to the HQ, they swore that they were not the true enemy, and Qui-Gon believed them. The longer they talked, the more Obi-Wan realized that perhaps he was naive in thinking that just because something claimed to be a democracy, it didn't mean that it operated as one. And they explained how Zerka was able to manipulate everything from official data and surveys of the system, impact reports, etc., that would have left the moon citizens with no real effect on government. He was used to seeing terrible warlords, but to see that back on Coruscant they could have been so righteously backing this corrupt system deeply troubled him. And he also saw how, to these people, Jedi was just a term for a bureaucratic bully, being both ineffective and yet carelessly cruel, as most people in the galaxy felt there was no rhyme or reason to the people that were protected by the Jedi or fought by the Jedi. When they went to leave, Jin promised to bring this up with Rael, and privately told Kenobi that perhaps this was all missed with Averross trying to overzealously defend the princess to make up for his loss of Nym. How else could he not see the manipulations by Czerka, that they ran prisons and lobbied to get a law passed that would outrage any Republic citizen, which allowed prisoners to be seized as property, including their children, in a loophole that would turn them into slaves. Slaves that walked past Rael every day in that palace. Kenobi knew that this was a giant lesson on the warnings of attachment, even to your own padawan, which was hard to take in the midst of his anger towards Jin and feelings of abandonment. Once the thieves picked them up, they all discussed the mysterious shields, and wondered if they were powered by colon crystals, but they couldn't figure out why there would be so many, and not combined with any offense, as they were still able to deflect the simple bolts. They would have to look into it further, but for now they headed back to Bajal, and again Jin hopes to get his padawan's input on his dream. And Kenobi makes sure to be more open and appreciate his master is speaking to him as valuable, reassuring him that he is not being arrogant to think that the Force was trying to show him something with this vision.
Hubris. To believe that the Force is at work in all this. That it would be at work in me. The Force is in all things, Master. That much Obi-Wan felt sure of.
The following day, Qui-Gon would bring up his concerns with Czerka, only to be quickly shot down by Rael, who pointed out that they accepted corruption on Coruscant. These corporations were longer standing and more powerful than even the Republic. There were only 2 days left before the treaty was to be signed, enshrining Czerka's position as the de facto ruler. But this whole day and into the night was spent by the Padawan researching the history and demographics of Bajal and the Moon, and he was finding that the census reports were indeed tampered with, and that the treaty would have Czerka becoming the only corporation that could operate the hyperspace lane and control trade. The system would certainly grow richer, but the voting effects were a sham, and the use of outside cheap labor and privatized prisons further funneled the bulk of the wealth to the corporation and government officials. When Jin called back to the council for intervention, Yoda explained that he was doubtful that Chancellor Kaj would have time for this backwater world. As expected, the Czerka folks understood the system down to the schedule, and in these last weeks of her chancellorship, Kaj was being bombarded by requests from all over the galaxy, and Jin was frustrated by Yoda's cold and detached response, and Yoda explained that he must focus on this hyperlane.
The hyperspace. Master Yoda, forgive me, but are you putting the profit of corporations ahead of the people of Pijal?
Sir, planets long cut off this corridor will. Planets struggling with poverty and famine. Will you save Pijal at the cost of their lives?
Jin apologized, and in this we can see the difficulties of working at this scale. Both were right. There was never a perfect system in the real world, and though in a literal elitist tower, Yoda still kept in touch with nature. The as opposed to what question that all must answer. Countless billions across the galaxy starved and died as slaves every day. And he had been fighting this for hundreds of years, knowing that it was also countless billions that had been uplifted through this time, and knowing the frustration of this slow but true progress. But Jin still pushed, prompting Yoda to ask what should be done with the species that fed their weak children to the strong, others that killed the elderly to save resources. But Qui-Gon snapped that this was humans oppressing humans. They needed to use their power to crush this evil.
Want to rule, do you? Dangerous this is in one who would join the council. Dangerous it is in any Jedi.
And Yoda tempered this with his understanding of Jin's frustration, but pointed out that the dream of creating a morally good dictatorship was always doomed to fail, a trick by the dark side, and one that had been the greatest predator of the Jedi throughout the history of the Order. And the little green master made sure to end the calm by praising Jin in his thorough investigation. That night, he suffered the same vision of a saber attack involving the princess, and the following morning he was firm on his decision, announcing at the royal table that he would not give this treaty the backing of the Jedi Order. Rael was furious, while the princess was just curious, and the Czerka advisor was trying to remain calm and cross-examine this vision. Fanry just seemed happy to not have to go through with the ceremony, but Rael shouted that the council will correct this. Less than an hour later, with the palace in chaos, Rael crashed down on Kenobi, asking when his master started taking the prophecy stuff so serious. and the Padawan shows his confidence growing. Just days earlier, he had been rattled and nervous in Rael's intense presence, but now replied with a funny little retort, saying, as far as I could tell, since this morning. But he did promise to try and learn more about the vision, and Kenobi remains confident and concise, telling his master that it is convenient that his vision aligns with stopping the treaty, something Jin very consciously was hoping for. And it was an odd feeling, like Jin was the child, and that he was the master, as he paced the room trying to talk him down from this fantasy. Saying what now? Was Jin to believe in the Chosen One, with a mother born from darkness giving birth to darkness? And Qui-Gon couldn't believe it, but he simply said,
Yes, I think I have to. Now that I stand where the prophets have stood, I must listen to them in humility, not in judgment. When I was younger, I was capable of that. I only hope I can find the strength to believe again.
And as Obi pushed back, saying that it was thinking that a Jedi had exclusive or special insight into the Force that led to the dark side, his master finally lost his cool.
I'm not turning to the dark side, Qui-Gon snapped. Not every disagreement with Jedi orthodoxy turns you into a Sith Lord overnight.
Kenobi showed a trait of hopefulness and focus that would only grow stronger over his life. He was set on the possibility that they could convince Rael and Fanry to change the terms of the treaty. Jin had lost hope in them, however, and as the Padawan left, Qui-Gon stopped him to finally explain why he had never trained him past the basic lightsaber forms, saying that almost every case of a Jedi dying in combat could have been prevented if they just stuck to a simple technique. That Qui-Gon wanted him to be untouchable, that while so many others rushed off to flashy and rare styles, he wanted Obi-Wan to be a master of the strikes that were practical and effective, and defensive moves that were so solid nothing could break through. A fight style that when paired with Obi-Wan's love of orthodoxy would surely drive any opponent mad, forcing them to flee or open themselves up. And this was a nice parallel to Jin's assertion that the Order's flaws came from straying away from the fundamentals, how they originally operated, listening to and being guided by the Force. His mind was racing as he left, with the understanding that his master had been helping him, that what he thought was the best proof of careless leadership was actually one of Jin's best teachings. And it hurt him even more that he was about to go behind his master's back. He felt that Jin's actions bordered on illegal, to go against the will of the Chancellor and Council. So without his master, he contacted the Order, and with a full council in attendance, explained the issue. In the conversation, Koth lets out that Yoda was right in not voting to give Jin a promotion, and Obi-Wan was hurt and defensive of his master. And while all the other masters were denouncing how seeking the path of the future led to the dark side, Yoda corrects them, saying no, seeking visions is taking power, but this vision came to him unbidden. While they descended into philosophical debate, Kenobi summoned the confidence to interrupt a chamber full of the most powerful Jedi Masters, telling them to please focus on what they will do, what he should do now, as he was just hours away from returning to the moon. To which Yoda simply told him that he needed to think about what Obi-Wan wanted to do next, and abruptly ended the transmission. When they did approach the moon, Obi-Wan showed the Master and the thieves a location that he had determined must be of importance to the Black Guards, knowing what to look for after that last attack and info from the Art Kids. The Jedi were also sporting blasters and leg holsters, along with their sabers as they raced through the jungle, set on overwhelming those personal shields this time. But as they monitored a Zerka mine working a hidden forest cave, they saw everyone chucking colon crystals into a trash pile. Just as Obi was thinking they must not be connected with the Black Guards, a trio of troop transports raced up to the mine and started blasting. The true terrorist rushed out to engage them, and as he watched his master's calm face firing away with blaster and using his saber in defense, though the shields were still proving impenetrable, he felt a strange calm himself as he repeated the phrase of the Guardians of the Wills.
I am one with the Force, Obi-Wan thought, recalling an old saying of the Guardians of the Wills. The Force is with me.
And for the first time in combat, he felt truly guided by the Force. The results were amazing, moving in what felt like slow motion, no fear.
Usually in battle the Force seemed to fall silent, not to desert him but to become no more than instinct. This time, however, Obi-Wan found himself connecting to everything around him.
Rahara on the Thieves' ship came racing in to buzz and scatter the Black Guards, and was happy to see the slaves escape the blaster fire, but she was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, and as the Jedi went to help, they were cut off by Zerka defenses kicking in. Droidekas rolled up from concealed shafts, and within seconds, shields were up, and powerful bolts demanded their full concentration. And with these activated, the staff began to flee via simple cargo ships, and the jewel thief Rahara was identified as a runaway slave, hit with a numbing dart by a floating droid, tagged, and scooped up into one of the evacuating ships. Jin hoped that Obi-Wan knew what he meant by shouting triangulate, and the Padawan moved perfectly in sync, causing the droids to fire into each other, overwhelming their shields and disabling them. They ran to the downed ship and hoped Rahara had got away somewhere, while overhead the palace ships were engaging the Black Guard transports, with Zerka ones trying to escape the fray. With this pause, Jin smiled at the sight of Obi-Wan. He was covered in mud, torn cloak, yet the uptight kid was happier than he'd seen him in a while. And the Padawan confessed he had felt at one with the Force as never before. Seconds later, Captain Darren of the Queen's Guard contacted Jin, and the Jedi asked them to search for the lost pilots. Jin would return to the palace to have another debate with Rael over the vision, and teachings of the Jedi Order as a whole, in light of their shared master leaving. Then to try and convince the Zerka rep in the palace to sell him Rahara, but she would not budge, saying that runaway slaves had to be made an example of. While Obi-Wan stayed with Pax to work on the downed ship, the Council contacted him with news on their decision, one he would present to Jin in person when they met back up in the palace. When his master was confused why everyone was proceeding as if the coronation was going forward, as if they had sent some new master from Coruscant.
The Council has named me the rightful representative of the Republic for the purposes of the ceremony. Rael contacted them and this was their answer. I contacted them.
He explained that with their impasse, he felt that he had to contact the Order, and Jin was furious and felt betrayed. Obi-Wan explained that he was able to push for a new clause, saying the slavery would only last for another year, and then could be voted on, and the Senate was making it very clear that a galactic trade partner needed to give up this barbaric practice. Jin, however, was unimpressed.
Are they naive enough to think that Zerka won't bribe every newly elected official? Are you?
Kenobi fought back that his master was showing no faith in democracy, and that he did believe his master's vision, but felt that this was the only way forward, leaving Jin to storm out, saying the blood was on Kenobi's hands. The following day, Jin would contact Pax with a proposal the old thief couldn't believe. A Jedi planning a risky raid of the Zerka slave processing facility. And to Jin's surprise, Obi-Wan wasn't just on board, he helped come up with a better plan, saying they should strike right after the ceremony, when Zerka was still focused on the palace, but that tonight they would be on high alert to make sure everything went well.
Thank you, Obi-Wan. I needed that clarity. Of course you're angry with me, but you'd always put the mission first. Always.
The teenage Obi-Wan was rapidly rising to his future role as a Jedi Knight, but they were interrupted by booming sounds from outside the palace. Rael feared the visions were coming true, but instead it was leader of the opposition, Haylen Azuka, descending on hover platform, proclaiming her surrender and to make a final plea. The guards quickly surrounded her, but she explained that her datapad held info to exonerate them, using a thumbprint scanned from their last meeting. Once opened, it revealed the location of one of the Black Guard ships that landed on Pijal after that last attack. Rael was angry and doubtful, but Jin convinced him to check it out. When they came up to the site, scans showed that it was an ancient fort, but which had been packed full of new tech and weaponry, including droidekas, and luckily their scanning droid hit the stealth shield first, exploding into debris and forcing the ship to make a hard pull to the right. Averos thought this was proof of a trap, but calmed himself to plan the strike. Slowly they made their way through the defenses, but once they couldn't find any scrap of evidence as to who they were, no logs, no comm devices, but they did find an astromech that showed it received calls from Corellia, Scipio, and Teth. That last connection to the Hutts was worrisome, so Jin said to just call them back. And Obi-Wan was shocked to see his old captor Thurible, the Hutts' major domo. He swore that they were just interested in buying an experimental personal shield generator, and that they were working with an official member of the government. This could have just been a lie, but after they ended the call, Obi-Wan was cautious as he brought up how Captain Darren did fit the bill. He could have warned this base to evacuate, and did advise just blowing it up once they closed in. And the Padawan even made a point to tie this to the vision, saying that it didn't contradict it. Jin should definitely keep a close eye on him during the coronation. As they returned to the ship, Jin apologized for being angry with him. He was working so hard to make Obi-Wan confident and independent, and now he was about to represent the entire Jedi Order, after contacting the Masters on his own. And this triggered a curious memory in the Padawan.
You know, I never had problems with that as a youngling. Being independent, I mean. I broke rules right and left. They even called me rebellious. Don't you see, Obi-Wan? They knew you'd rebel against any master you worked with. So they made sure you wound up with a Jedi who almost never followed the rules. The only way for you to rebel was to become the perfect Jedi. They really did that, didn't they?
As they really processed the genius behind this, Qui-Gon said to never underestimate Yoda. The following morning marked the day that would change this world forever. And 2 hours after he had to be in position, the noble guests would come, with Qui-Gon sitting right in the front row, next to the Zerka rep, all laughing at how the rugged rail was done up in fancy clothing and with a fresh cut. When the ceremony began, it was Captain Darren that escorted the Queen-to-be. When the music was finished and all stood in position, covered in beautiful lights of this holy chamber, the Skykeeper, head of the space-pondering religion, stepped forward, raised the blade, and read the oath. And once she took up the ceremonial blade, becoming queen, her first action was to run the blade through the holy man. Obi-Wan went to reach for his saber, but was stopped by a blaster put to his head by Captain Darren. Rael was screaming in a voice mixed with utter defeat, confusion, and anger, but the queen carried on with her speech, proclaiming that Zerka and her regent Avaros were corrupt and would sell out the people for profit. Jin noticed that a larger version of the lightsaber-proof shield had enveloped her platform, while she and Darren had their own additional shields on top of that. Rael was still in shock, but Jin told him to try and contact outside aid, as the blast doors sealed them all in. Fanry was handing out judgments for all the VIPs in the room, saying who would die and who would live. And when Jin rushed the shields, he was harmlessly deflected, and she calmly states that she admired his virtue. He would be spared for seeing the Zerka corruption, but this Padawan would have to die. He wanted to force the treaty through, so with a nod to Darren, he moved his finger to the trigger. But in a flash that was so quick that Jin could barely see it as more than a blur, Kenobi ignited his blade and swung back in one seamless move. And the blade was not blue, but a bright orange, that sliced right through the special shield and into his captor. Fanry moved quickly, and her slave girl reminded her to grab the generator, as she was in on the plot all along, and royal guards dropped down through the shattered glass ceiling, and they were evac'd while the Jedi looked on helplessly. Rael Avaros joined them and didn't say a word, until Jin asked what happened with the saber. The Padawan wasn't sure, but his guess was that when the weapons were checked overnight, they switched out his real crystal for what they thought was an ineffective Colon one. With the size and weight being so similar, you wouldn't notice any change. This orange blade was much shorter and less stable, but the dagger size was enough to make it through and down the captain. And Rael added that this was even better, since Darren was alive and now being interrogated. While the others were still trying to process everything, Jin already had a plan. They tracked Her Highness and the royal guards upon the ship Righteous, which was intercepting the Zerka slave ship, the Leverage. Rael and Jin would have to take the Queen in, while Pax and Obi would use their covert smuggling ship to get in and prevent Zerka retaliation against Pajal, and hopefully save Rohana as well. The Queen would intercept them via holo, and she greets them peacefully as if there was no reason for alarm, adding that she was the sole ruler, and she knew that the Senate and all of Coruscant was just as corrupt as Zerka. She only had faith in herself, and she would operate as a good dictator leading a fine and noble war against Zerka. Meanwhile, Obi and Pax were working through the intestinal, snaking, labyrinthian corridors of the Zerka processing ship, massive and on a scale that would rival future Star Destroyers. Pax would sneak through the ship to find Rahara, while Obi stayed with their ship in the hangar, and with their forged codes, the droid shouldn't blink a cybernetic eye at them. But when the thieves reunited and made their way back, an alarm was set off, and Obi's hangar deck went into high alert. They were finally identified, and Pax's modified Gazanti-class cruiser, which had a Geonosian-made Nivik starfighter, something that seemed similar to the Nantex, was attached to the underside of the Gazanti, and Obi hoped to use it to fire on the droids swarming in. He engaged the auto-fire lock-on, but then also hit auto-pursuit, detaching the ship and sending it zooming through the corridors.
Obi-Wan could steer the ship, but he couldn't stop it. His hands clenched the controls as the starfighter zipped into the open corridor. Now he was in a tunnel, one that twisted and turned, with no more than a meter of safety on each side.
Rahara and Pax needed a distraction to escape, and when they smashed up a bunch of consoles, it released groups of slaves that led a revolt on board. Jin was able to pick up Zerka comms going crazy trying to respond, and use this against the Queen to get her to stand down. Over Holo, Rael made a last plea that she could either have revenge on Zerka and destroy their massive flagship HQ, or save the revolting slaves that she claimed to be fighting for. But vengeance won her heart, and despite her friend and slave servant Candy's plea to not blow up the flagship, the Queen had her officers ready the weapons, forcing Kandri to lift her blaster to the bloodthirsty monarch, saying, "I guess today, we're having 2 revolutions." Jin was able to contact the Zerka ship bridge and explain that under Republic law, all the slaves on this massive ship would be considered involved in this extreme political turmoil, a battle between the Queen, opposition, Black Guards, and Zerka assets, including these sentient assets, whose revolt in this overthrow of the Queen would be seen as politically motivated, and thus Republic laws forbid them from being held against their will as political prisoners, if a Republic official deemed it so. And right on cue, the tiny Geonosian craft raced right into the enormous bridge and came to an abrupt and chaotic pause, before sitting down to finally free Obi-Wan, pale and more nauseous than he'd ever been in his entire life. Jin was laughing, asking did he really just fly a ship through another ship?
It was terrible, he said, his eyes staring fixedly ahead. I don't ever want to fly again. Ever.
Zerka was forced to comply, to take this loss on this backwater sector and stay on the Republic's good side. And after the smoke cleared, 300 plus slaves were freed with Obi-Wan giving the proclamation. And back on Pajal, the Queen's crown was placed on Fanry's cousin, who only wore it long enough to sign a new treaty into law. No more monarchs, democratic representation, no slavery in the entire system, and the hyperlane was constructed. The Force truly did work in mysterious ways, and when Jin talked to Rael, he learned his own friend felt these mysteries were to be explored outside the Order.
Maybe this path, maybe it's not for me. Rael looked up at Qui-Gon with a sad smile. When you're on the Jedi Council, don't forget me. Impossible.
When he was ready to head back to Coruscant, he found Kenobi in the Varactyl stables, petting the creature he had bonded with during the hunt. And the master said that it was finally time to return home, and pick his new master. Cryptic as always, joking that he was taking control of the future. The debrief with the council would end with a short debate on if the prophecy was true, but Jin held that it was, and that it led him to act exactly as he needed. Fanry wasn't the victim, no Sith blade, but he was supposed to object, forcing Obi-Wan into position, since Fanry had been shown how to take apart Kenobi's blade. Since Jin's blade worked differently, and the swap would have failed, they would have asked him to just go through the ceremony unarmed. He would have been killed by Captain Darren, and the Queen would now be at war with Zerka, costing countless lives. Jin was sure that at the very least, this was how one was supposed to honor visions from the Force. That he was in the time of prophecy, with the Kyber that was not Kyber. And to his own surprise, and peace, he was set on turning down the offer to join the Council. And it wasn't even from his feelings that the Jedi had become the Republic's police, or his frustrations with their status quo and acceptance of evil practices across the galaxy, but he told the Masters that he was declining because
my relationship to the Force has changed. Qui-Gon said, I wish to be silent for a while, to surrender to it, to accept whatever the Force brings. Joining the Council would take me far away from that goal.
Later he would go to Kenobi's quarters and explain the conversation to the Council. And the Padawan was less shocked than he expected to be, joking that it was very much like Qui-Gon to not even agree with the Council in their thought that he should have the highest honor and position. But with respect, also acknowledged that if Jin believed this is what the Force wanted, he had to follow that path.
Which comes to the question of whether you'll follow it with me. If you would prefer another master, I won't be offended. If it were up to me, though, we would continue on as we are. Qui-Gon grinned back, and they clasped hands, more truly partners than ever before.
In this year of 40 BBY, the 17-year-old Obi-Wan Kenobi finally felt like he was paired with the right master, that he was about to embark on a path that would unite the practical-focused modern Jedi reality with the mysteries of the ancient mystics, a path that would lead him to becoming one of the most important Jedi in the entire history of the Jedi Order. A story that we will pick up in part 2 of the complete life of Obi-Wan Kenobi. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. It's the best way to help me out. Subscribe if you want to see more, and check out the links down in the description. Special thanks to our supporters over on Patreon, especially our $25 tier supporters, Bill Payne, Oscar Jones, and Renee Flores. But most important of all, remember, never discount the mad mystics of old. You might just end up one, and the Force will be with you, always.